Hello, everybody, and welcome. Today we have Dr. DeGowin with us to talk about his new book. And I'd just like to remind everybody to please silence your cell phones if you haven't already. So please join me in welcoming Dr. DeGowin.
Thank you for coming. I appreciate that. My son came from Madison, Wisconsin, and Iowa to be here. I thank him. I'd like to thank the reviewers of the book, too. Margie Nelson, Bill O'Connor, Dr. Charles Platts, Dr. Bob Rakel, and Dr. George Weiner. And thank goodness they did a nicer job of reviewing this book than Abraham Lincoln did for a book. When he was asked to review a book, he said, "For those who like this kind of a book, this is the kind of a book they will like." The title of the book is Physician's Challenges, taken from a quote from patron saint of internal medicine, Sir William Osler, who said that the physician's challenge is the curing of disease, educating people in the laws of health, and preventing the spread of plagues and pestilences. And it's really two books. And Steve Semken, who's been so good with me, suggested combining the two, which made a lot of sense when it finally happened. And the first book is called The Chance for Redemption, Payback. On 5 February 1958, in his fifth appearance before the parole board, Nathan Leopold said in part, "All I want in this life is a chance to prove to you and the people of Illinois what I know in my own heart to be true, that I can and will be a decent, self-respecting, and law-abiding citizen, to have a chance to find redemption for myself by service to others. It's for that chance that I humbly beg." He was released then from Stateville Penitentiary several years later. And on a cold day in February, a letter arrived in my mailbox addressed to the officer in charge, Malaria Project, Illinois State Penitentiary, Box 1112, Joliet, Illinois. The letter was signed by Nathan Leopold. 7 years, on 8 February 1965, 7 years after his discharge from Stateville, where he had spent 33 years of a life plus 99 years for killing Bobby Franks, the thrill killing of the 20th century that occurred in Chicago that many of you heard of. He was writing as a research assistant from the social science program in Puerto Rico, where he'd gone after release from prison, planning to undertake drug testing in experiments using prisoners in the local penitentiary as volunteer subjects similar to studies at the malaria project at Stateville. And he requested a copy of the release, like the one he had signed, when he volunteered to take malaria there in the spring of 1945. The document we used described the benefits to society, the risks to the volunteer, and govern our conduct of studies of human beings dictated by the rules of the Nuremberg Code and the Declaration of Helsinki. In a way, it was my opportunity for redemption, payback, 10 years of deferments from the Army, while my friends served in Korea and other places. So I volunteered for the doctor's draft, and with arrangements beforehand to be assigned to Walter Reed Army Institute of Research, and with duty station at the malaria project in Stateville Penitentiary, Illinois' maximum security penitentiary. Now, I hadn't gone there to study malaria because that was done for the most part, and the big laboratory of the malaria project was really studying red blood cell enzymology, because the scientists there, in studying primaquine that cured Vivax relaxing malaria, caused hemolysis, destruction of red blood cells, in 10% Black Americans. Black Americans couldn't get Vivax malaria because they don't have a Duffy receptor for the parasite on the red cell. But in the drug studies that would relate to administering anti-malaria drugs to troops, they took primaquine, and 10% had destruction of the red cells. And these scientists found that the hexose monophosphate shunt of the red cell, its sugar metabolism that keeps it alive for how long? John, how long do you think a red cell can live in the body?
30 days.
How long? 30?
80.
It lives for 4 months, 120 days. And it was shown to do this by research in Elmer DeGowin's laboratories at the University of Iowa. But anyway, in order to keep pumping out sodium and keeping potassium in the red cell that keeps it viable, it has to have sugar metabolism so that it can carry the hemoglobin, the red cell, red pigment, to carry oxygen to the distant tissues of the body. And this was basic research that was sponsored by the Surgeon General of the U.S. Army, the University of Chicago, who ran the program, and the Illinois State Corrections Department. 3 huge bureaucracies. Anyway, so I had gone down there to study basic red cell metabolism, but in the meantime, Captain Snell in Vietnam came down with falciparum malaria that was not cured by chloroquine, the usual drug that cured falciparum malaria, which is a much more aggressive form than the Vivax. He got another course, relapsed after that, and another course. Finally, he got IV quinine, which cured him. But in studying his red cells, at Stateville at the Malaria Project, it was found out that this parasite had mutated to one which was not only resistant to chloroquine, but to hydroxychloroquine, amidiaquine, atabrine, proguanil, pyrimethamine, all of the standard and malaria drugs. And it was quite sensitive, thank goodness, to quinine sulfate. And so that permitted us to do studies to try to complete our mission, which was to find a cure and a prevention for the spread of this lethal form of malaria in Southeast Asia. So, medical officers and myself undertook clinical studies of malaria with inmate volunteers because our commander-in-chief, President Lyndon B. Johnson, ordered U.S. combat troops into regions of endemic malaria in Vietnam, where multi-drug resistant Plasmodium falciparum malaria defied radical cure by chloroquine and many other previously effective drugs. Scientists have been unable to grow malaria parasites in vitro and tissue culture. The studies that were carried out with Plasmodium cynomolgi, monkey malaria, were not predictive of effectiveness of drugs for human beings. Neither studies in another model, Plasmodium berghei, for mice. So that the studies had to be carried out in human beings. There were many patients who'd received malaria for other reasons. Moreover, observations of patients treated with malaria to abate the insanity of tertiary syphilis in patients naturally acquiring the disease had yielded equivocal results, unhelpful in developing regimens for the prevention and radical cure of multi-drug resistant malaria. Therefore, we carried out these studies in healthy volunteer inmates, age of many of our troops, in the maximum security prison, Stateville Penitentiary, to determine the efficacy and toxicity of drugs to prevent and cure mosquito-induced multi-drug resistant falciparum malaria, sensitive only to intravenously administered quinine sulfate, then in short supply outside the malaria project. So it couldn't be given to troops, there wasn't enough of it for that purpose, for all those that might become infected. So for the safety of the volunteer, study participants were hospitalized and cared for by experienced physicians and nurses who relied on immediate laboratory support in the University of Chicago Army Medical Research Project, a project with a 20-year record of safe operation. No inmate was coerced to volunteer, and all men participated after giving their informed consent verbally and writing. Nathan Leopold was writing me to get one of the forms that inmates signed for that informed consent. and physicians and investigators in their and our staff adhered strictly to the rules of the Nuremberg Code for the safe conduct of experimental studies in human subjects. No permanent injuries or untoward events occurred during the studies, and we found a way to prevent drug-resistant falciparum malaria and cure it, multi-drug resistant, and presented that to the Surgeon General of the Army in May of 1965, which then resulted in field trials in Vietnam and proved effective. So this book is dedicated to the inmates who volunteered for this study and the people that made it all happen. The second book is a book called Discovery is Our Business. And let me see. I've got these photographs on the wall of my little den here in the apartment of these friends. And I got to thinking what they'd accomplished. Anyway, and I wanted to tell their stories of doctors who made a difference in patients' lives to make them better. And that's what the second book is about. I imagine reporters from the Chicago Tribune smiled as I did when they read the plaque above the door to the laboratory of Dr. Charles Huggins, "Discovery is Our Business." They had come to the University of Chicago to interview Dr. Huggins when they learned the committee in Stockholm had just announced Dr. Huggins would receive the 1966 Nobel Prize in Medicine, shared with Dr. Peyton Rouse of the Rockefeller Institute. In recalling this event that happened over 50 years ago, it occurred to me that I hadn't realized it when I was associated with the School of Medicine for over a decade as a medical student, a resident, research assistant, assistant professor, that the University of Chicago was an extraordinary place where good people made good things happen. I had the unusual privilege of working with remarkable doctors who, in addition to teaching medical students and caring for their patients, studied their patients' diseases and found new ways of treating their illnesses, even curing them. Jake, Leon Jacobson, I talked about in the first book, who was dean of the College of Medicine. He was a hematologist. And he was an advisor for the metallurgical lab at the University of Chicago, which was the Manhattan Project during World War II, where they were enriching uranium-235, where on the 2nd of December, 1942, CP1, Chicago Pile 1, went critical. Enrico Fermi, the Italian navigator, has landed. It was the first sustained chain reaction of a nuclear fission that initiated the atomic age. Jake was a resident, an advisor to this laboratory group to make sure they didn't get too much radiation. He'd done some work in that field. He was also the advisor to the toxicity lab, which was studying nitrogen mustard because the Americans were concerned that the Nazis might use it as the Germans did in World War I. They were trying to figure out ways to neutralize it. And Clarence Lushbaugh, one of the investigators there, had shown that if you injected rats with this element of poison gas, all of their lymph nodes and their spleens atrophied, shrunk. And Jake and Clarence Lushbaugh talked about this, and they said, well, patients with lymphoma, Hodgkin disease, have large lymph nodes and splenic involvement. That's part of that's the illness. So, in a patient without any other options who agreed readily to this, Jake and his resident Mike Bonfilio, by the way, who was later here in orthopedics, administered nitrogen mustard to a patient with chronic with lymphatic leukemia. And patient became nauseated and vomited. Jake sat up with him all night. But in a couple of days, these large masses in his neck and under his arms got soft. And pretty soon, they went away. And I remember as a resident seeing one of his patients in clinic of that early time of treating. This was a patient with Hodgkin disease who'd been treated monthly with nitrogen mustard. 20 years he'd survived instead of the usual 4-year median survival for Hodgkin disease. Amazing. And of course later then, developed at the MIH MOP, mustargin, oncovin, procarbazine, prednisone, a multi-drug group related to, dependent on nitrogen mustard, was curative for patients with advanced Hodgkin disease. Not everybody, but amazing. So this was one of the things that Jake did. Another person, Janet Rowley. Janet came to us when had a laboratory down the hall from mine when I was an assistant professor. And she had been on sabbatical in England learning how to produce karyotypes of bone marrow. That is, growing bone marrow cells in culture, stopping them at mitosis, separating out the chromosomes and photographing, microphotographing. There's a characteristic change in patients with chronic myelocytic leukemia. Those they get this disease in their 20s to 50s rather than the older age. And it's called the Philadelphia chromosome. And it's a small chromosome. And Janet found out that it's a 22-9 translocation of the 46 chromosomes. There's a piece of 22 that gets to 9. And then she found a change in 821 in acute myeloblastic leukemia. And Now it looked like maybe this was related to the cause of the disease. And it turns out it probably is. And that cancer is a genetic disease in that sense. So the enzyme that produces this fusion protein, tyrosine kinase, somebody said, well, if you inhibit that, then maybe you can stop the disease. So imunotib, which is a monoclonal antibody against this tyrosine kinase, called commercially Gleevec, did. And for patients that had a median survival of 2.5 years, if you got Gleevec for your chronic myelocytic leukemia for as long as 8 or 10 years, you had a normal lifetime survival. Janet got the Medal of Freedom presented by President Barack Obama for her work. Amazing. Well, Dr. Huggins was one of the early faculty at the University of Chicago. And he was trained as a surgeon at the University of Michigan for his residency and fellowship after graduating from Harvard. And he joined the faculty as the clinical faculty was developed when the University Hospital was built on the south side of Chicago. Previously, Rush Medical School had trained the clinical medical students. And he was part of that new faculty. And they were full-time, which was, well, the AMA, some members called them communists because they were salaried physicians, and no other medical school in the country had salaried physicians on their faculty. And there were very few until Iowa had salaried physicians for the first time in 1946. Anyway, he had a lot of time to do research. And his chief said, you're going to be a urologist. So he was in the lab, and he was studying dogs and catheterizing their seminal vesicles. And he found out they had, in the seminal fluid, high levels of acid phosphatase. And it occurred to him, well, patients with advanced prostate cancer have high levels of acid phosphatase in their serum. Anyway, when he castrated the dogs, the acid phosphatase level dropped. So Cornelius Vermeulen, his residents, flash forward, see this patient brought in severe advanced prostate cancer with bedridden, with metastases in bone, and couldn't get out of bed because of the pain. And they said, well, informed consent. We've been doing these studies in dogs. Patient says anything. And so he performs, and it's called an orchiectomy, the first orchiectomy. Uh, well, within a week, the patient got out of bed and had less pain. And they said, well, the psychological effects of this operation really are remarkable, to see this. But then a month later, when they took x-rays of his bones, the metastases had shrunk. And the patient died 12 years later of a stroke. And of the other patients that underwent this therapy, and later all they had to do was block androgen. What was discovered, of course, was that some cancers require hormone stimulation to grow. And if you block the hormone stimulation, they atrophy. And so, anyway, to show that, plus the estrogen receptors on uterine tissue and breast tissue that Elwood Jensen, working in his laboratory, showed changed cancer therapy and changed lives for many people. Anyway, those are just 3 of about 6 or 7 stories I wanted to tell because I thought they needed to be told. Anyway, that's why I wrote the book. Thank you. Do I have to answer any questions you might have?
How do they cure the shortage of quinine, which must also have disappointed all those people who like gin and tonic?
Yeah. The story that I understood about that, John, was that, of course, during World War II, the Japanese had the cinchona trees in Java were captured. And so that's when Atabrine was developed as an antimalarial, so troops could be put on the line. And then the Farben Company in Germany developed Atabrine and a number of other drugs, and they were more effective than quinine, everybody thought, and so forth, and more available. And then in 1963, I understood that the pharmaceutical companies had stopped manufacturing quinine sulfate. And the Army Medical Corps just sold 8,000 ounces of it. And they, thank God, reneged on their contract and got it back. And that permitted us to do the studies because these multi-drug resistant falciparum malaria mutants were quite sensitive to quinine, meant that we could control and take care of our patients safely without, but that's what I understood about how it was available to us and not other people. There wasn't that much available to treat troops with. Steve.
I was wondering what it's like to be in a prison. And also, I know that prison had that Panopticon, and I was wondering if you ever went into that.
Yes.
And what, I'm not even sure that I fully understand what that is.
Stateville was, it's not now. It was a product of Joseph Reagan, who in the early 20s or 30s went in, and the convicts had stores and gambling and bribed the officers and all that sort of thing. And he was, Reagan, a warden, was such a disciplinarian. Nathan Kantrowitz wrote a book called Close Control. Went down there from University of Chicago as a sociologist to review inmates going to the parole board to see if they would recidivise, and stayed, instead of it 2 years, for 6 years. Left in 1963 when I wrote this book. He said things were so tightly controlled at Stateville that not only were the inmates disciplined, but the officers were also disciplined. So there couldn't be this interchange of corruption and bribery. And when I was there, went through the first day was something. Went through the entrance to the patted down and so on and so forth. And first time and last time in 2 years that it happened to me, I was there 24/7. Anyway, I never saw an officer with a weapon. No pistols, rifles, saps, batons, nothing. You entered a cage on the second floor of the administration building. One officer unlocked a steel door, and you walked in, and there was the armory with turrets that could accommodate a gun thrust through them. And then there was the other door. So when this door opened, this one was always closed, and you were in there with the telephone operator in the armory and so forth. And from there, you went on into the administration building. And the Malaria Project that had been operating for 20 years had the whole third floor of the prison hospital, which was the place where major surgery for all the other prisons took place. I mean, they were sent to Stateville, and they had good radiology, good physicians, and so forth to take care of inmates. And Mr. Messerschmidt looked as if he wasn't a young fellow. Well, he reminds me of some Oakville residents. I mean, you know, and, very functional, but if he was approached by a violent person, there would be no response. So the Panopticon was a idea of Jeremy Bentham, the utilitarianism philosopher in England. And Aaron Burr, when he exiled himself after the treason trial in Richmond in 1810, exiled himself and visited Jeremy Bentham, who described the Panopticon, which was a revolutionary idea about a prison in which it was a big cylinder with a central pillar and then pie-shaped cells with windows out to the side, and the guard was 2 or 3 floors up in this central guard station. I don't think he was armed. He wasn't armed. But if something had broken out in the cell, there were 4 of these that were like this. If something had broken out, they could take arms from the armory in the administration building down a stairway in a corridor that went underneath to the covered walkways to the prison cell blocks, and then come up in this pillar, armed, and control everything. That was the idea of the Panopticon. And apparently it must have been very expensive, because they had 4 of these plus more conventional rectangular cell block. They had a honor farm of 2,200 acres or something like that. And school to get your GED through high school that inmates could take English. You could get up to 3 years college credits through the college professors that had come to the prison and teach courses. So the other option was vocational school. It was before throwaway appliances, where you could fix TV sets and automobiles and that sort of thing. And so they taught that. And then there was the garment factory, where they made uniforms for all the guards and the prison system of Illinois. And then the sheet metal factory, where they made steel case like file cabinets and desks and drawers for all these institutions. The soap factory, of course, that was something that, the garment factory had a tailor that would come in and teach how to make the suit for the inmate that was being discharged. That was, anyway. So even with the industries, there was an opportunity to learn. And the farm, the honor farm, grew tremendous. They had a big cattle herd, and hogs, and grain, and canned food every fall. It was an amazing community. 4,000 inmates. Reduced the year I went there because they passed a law that with a life sentence, you could go to the board in 20 years. 7 years, good time. So they were really reducing its crowding in the prison, which was a good thing. And it gave hope to a lot of men that didn't have it. We had a staff of 18 inmates, and they performed very well. Some of them became certified as medical technologists with the national board and so forth, in hematology, in the chemistry lab, and it was an amazing place. Well, thank you.